The Galactic Council didn't shoot us. They didn't glass Earth or enslave our children. They did something much worse. They handed us an eviction notice and pointed us toward the abyss. 3 billion humans, packed into rusted colony ships, sent to die in the galactic dead zones where not even light seems to escape. They thought we would starve. They thought we would turn on each other. They were wrong. We didn't just survive the dark. We woke up what was sleeping there. The air scrubbers on the UNS Daedalus whined like a dying dog. Gideon Cole tightened the seal on his flight helmet, trying to block out the noise. It didn't work. The vibration rattled up his spine, a constant physical reminder that their oxygen recycling system was held together by duct tape and blind faith. Around him, the hangar deck of the retrofitted freighter was a masterclass in organized despair. Mechanics in stained coveralls worked frantically on engines that had been obsolete a century ago. The air tasted of ozone, burnt copper, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. Pre-flight checks look green, Cole. A voice crackled in his earpiece. It was Ilara Jenkins, Fleet Command. Her voice didn't have the crisp, authoritative bite it used to. It sounded thin, hollowed out. "Define green, Ilara," Gideon muttered, flicking a series of toggles on the overhead panel of his scout ship, the Stray Dog. The console flickered, went dark, and then rebooted with a tired hum. "I've got a port thruster that spits plasma every time I bank left, and my primary sensor array is basically guessing. It means you're not going to explode on the launch pad. Take the win, Gideon." Gideon sighed, his breath fogging the inside of his visor. Taking the win. He looked out the reinforced glass of his cockpit. Beyond the open hangar doors lay the fleet. 3,000 ships. That was all that was left of humanity's presence on the galactic stage. Luxury liners stripped of their gold plating and crammed with thousands of refugees. Cargo haulers with makeshift life support habitats welded to their hulls. Frigates that had been disarmed, their weapon ports welded shut by council peacekeepers. They looked like a trail of bruised, bleeding insects dragging themselves across the void. It had been 14 months since the eviction. 14 months since the High Council of the Orion Spur decided that humanity was a destabilizing variable. We hadn't started a war. We hadn't unleashed a bioweapon. We simply refused to bow. When the Kalan demanded absolute trade monopolies over our colonies, we negotiated elsewhere. When the Voth claimed our mining sectors as historical religious sites, we asked for proof. We played the political game, and we played it too well. We didn't realize the game was rigged until they voted unanimously to revoke our spatial sovereignty. The mandate was simple: relocate beyond the Veil within 90 days, or face orbital bombardment. The Veil was a massive expanse of dead space, uncharted nebulas, and stellar graveyards. It was a place where nav computers fried and supply lines snapped, a death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic red tape. "Gideon," Ilara's voice broke through his thoughts. "Fuel reserves on the Daedalus are down to 4%. The civilian transports are worse. We are coasting on fumes. If you don't find a jump point or a resource cluster on this run—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "I know," Gideon said. The weight of 3 billion starving people settled onto his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. "I'll find something. Just keep the lights on until I get back. Godspeed, Stray Dog." Gideon punched the launch sequence. The clamps released with a violent shudder. The Stray Dog shot out of the hangar and into the absolute black. The stars out here didn't twinkle. They were distant, muted pinpricks, struggling to pierce the thick, particulate dust of the Veil. He engaged the sublight engines. The ship groaned, rattling his teeth in his skull. He was pushing ahead of the fleet, a lone dog sniffing the darkness for a scrap of meat. The scanners swept the empty space, returning nothing but static and cosmic radiation. Gideon watched the fuel gauge tick down. The cabin was freezing. Fleet Command had mandated strict energy rationing, which meant life support was dialed back to bare minimums. Frost crept along the edges of his console. He rubbed his gloved hands together, his mind wandering back to Earth. He tried to remember the heat of the sun on his face, but the memory felt thin, like a photograph left out in the rain. All he knew now was the cold metal of his ship and the relentless, creeping hunger in his gut. They had been eating algae paste for 6 months. Real food was a myth told to the children in the lower decks. "Scans are negative," Gideon said to the empty cockpit, recording his log. "Nothing but rocks and dust, adjusting heading by 2 degrees, venturing into Sector 7 Delta." Sector 7 Delta wasn't just off the edge of the map. It was off the edge of the table. The Council's probes had never returned from this deep in the Veil. The magnetic interference was too strong, but humanity didn't have the luxury of caution anymore. As the stray dog plunged deeper into the nebula, the ambient light outside shifted from pitch black to a sickly, bruised purple. Dust particles the size of gravel pinged against the hull. The sound was like fingernails tapping on a coffin lid. Gideon's radar screen became a mess of false positives. Ghost ships, phantom planets. The magnetic field of the nebula was playing tricks on the aging sensors. He switched to manual optics, peering through the viewport, trusting his own eyes over the failing machinery. An hour passed. Then 2. The silence of the cockpit was deafening. Gideon's eyelids grew heavy. The cold was a narcotic, coaxing him to just close his eyes, just for a minute. Just let the ship drift. Suddenly, a harsh, synthesized beep cut through the silence. Gideon snapped awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He checked the primary monitor. Through the haze of static, a faint, rhythmic pulse was blinking. Ping, ping, ping. It wasn't a natural frequency. Pulsars didn't sound like that. Quasars didn't emit on that band. It was structured. It was artificial. "Command, this is Cole!" Gideon barked, hitting the comms. "I have a signal!" Static hissed back at him. "I command. Do you copy?" More static. He was too deep in the nebula. The interference was blocking the transmission. He was entirely alone. He looked at his fuel gauge. He had exactly enough to turn back and make it to the fleet. If he chased the signal, he wouldn't have enough juice to return. He would be stranded in the dark, waiting for his oxygen to run out. Gideon looked at the flashing light on the console. It was a gamble, a massive, stupid gamble. But returning to the fleet with nothing meant certain death for everyone. This was a chance. It might be a pirate cache. It might be a derelict council ship. It might be a bullet to the head. He gripped the throttle. "Better a quick death than a slow one," he muttered. He banked the stray dog hard to the right, driving the ship deeper into the purple bruise of the nebula, chasing the ghost in the machine. The nebula was thick here, a churning soup of ionized gas and dead matter. The hull of the stray dog screamed as micrometeoroids sandblasted the outer plating. Gideon gripped the flight yoke, fighting the turbulence. The ship bucked like a wild horse, throwing him hard against his harness. "Come on, you piece of junk," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Hold together." The signal was getting stronger. The rhythmic ping on his console was no longer a whisper. It was a steady, metallic heartbeat. It was pulling him in. His displays were utterly useless now. The navigation screen was a swirl of chaotic colors. The proximity sensors wailed indiscriminately. Gideon was flying blind, using the signal strength as his only compass. The purple gas outside the viewport grew denser, swirling in violent, spiraling eddies. Then the gas broke. The stray dog punched through the dense wall of the nebula and entered a pocket of clear, empty space. Gideon pulled back on the throttle, throwing the engines into reverse to kill his momentum. The sudden deceleration slammed him forward. He gasped, his lungs straining against the harness. As the ship stabilized, he looked out the viewport. His breath caught in his throat. Floating in the dead center of the clearing was a structure. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a station. It defied all standard classifications of scale. It was a massive, brutalist geometric shape, a perfect, jet-black tetrahedron that was easily the size of Earth's moon. It swallowed the faint starlight, absorbing it into its matte, featureless surface. There were no lights, no engine ports, no docking bays, just sheer, imposing geometry. It looked ancient, not just old, but primordial, a monument left behind by gods who had grown bored and moved on. Gideon unclipped his harness, his hands shaking slightly. He floated up toward the glass, staring at the sheer immensity of the thing. The Kaelin built elegant, curving spires. The Vorth built golden, ringed stations. This was something else entirely. It lacked any aesthetic pretension. It was pure, unadulterated function. He tapped the comms array. The static had cleared now that he was out of the gas clouds. Jenkins. Jenkins, do you read me? A long moment of silence followed. Then, a heavily distorted voice came through. Cole, is that... Where the hell are you? You went off the grid. Ilara, I need the fleet to jump to my coordinates. Now. Negative, Gideon. We don't have the fuel for a blind jump. We are prepping to alter course toward a dwarf star system to see if we can siphon... Ilara, listen to me, Gideon yelled, his voice cracking. Forget the dwarf star. I found something. You have to see this. I am sending you the telemetry data now. He punched a sequence on his keypad, compressing the visual and sensor data and firing it back through the clearing in the nebula. 30 agonizing seconds passed. Gideon! Ilara's voice was barely a whisper. What is that? I don't know, but the signal is coming from inside it. It's artificial, it's intact, and it's not council tech. It could be a trap. It could be a quarantine zone. The council forbids exploration of precursor anomalies. The council left us to starve in the dark. Gideon slammed his fist against the console. We are dead anyway, Ilara. The Daedalus has days of power left. The civilian ships have hours. We need shelter. We need resources. If this thing has a power core, if it has a hollow interior, we can dock the fleet. It's our only chance. He heard hurried whispering on the other end. Ilara was talking to Commander Hayes, the man nominally in charge of the Ragged Armada. Gideon, Hayes's gruff voice came over the line. Are you telling me to bet the lives of 3 billion people on a giant black rock you found in the dark? I'm telling you that you don't have a choice, Commander. The rock is the only hand we have left to play. A heavy sigh echoed through the comms. We're spooling up the drives. We will be at your coordinates in 2 hours. Do not engage the structure. Do not attempt to dock. Just sit tight. Copy that, Commander. Gideon cut the feed. He looked at his fuel gauge. It was flashing red. He couldn't go back, even if he wanted to. He sat in the freezing cockpit for 2 hours, staring at the monolithic shape. It didn't do anything. It just existed. An anchor in the void. He felt like an ant staring at a monolith. There was a crushing sense of insignificance that radiated from the structure. It made the entirety of human history feel like a fleeting, microscopic accident. Eventually, space around him began to warp. A brilliant flash of Cherenkov radiation illuminated the dark, and the human fleet tore their way into normal space. They looked even worse against the backdrop of the massive structure. The Daedalus led the vanguard, its hull scarred and blackened. Behind it came the thousands of civilian ships, a disorganized swarm of dying metal. Gideon's comms lit up. "This is Commander Hayes to the fleet. We hold position here. Cole, what's your status?" "Running on emergency batteries, Commander. Requesting permission to find a way inside." "Negative. We send probes first." Gideon watched as a dozen automated drones shot out from the Daedalus, zipping toward the black tetrahedron. They reached the surface and began to map the exterior, sweeping with lasers and ground-penetrating radar. "Nothing," Ilara reported over the fleet-wide channel. "No thermal signatures, no radiation leaks. The hull is made of a composite we can't identify. It's absorbing the radar. It's completely solid." "It can't be solid," Gideon argued. "The signal is coming from inside. There has to be a door, a seam, something." "The drones are picking up a microscopic trench, 1 kilometer wide, running the entire equator of the structure. But it's sealed." Gideon looked at his dying ship. The emergency life support was beginning to fail. The air was getting thin. "Commander," Gideon said, "I'm going to the trench. I gave you a direct order, Cole. Stand down." "My ship is dead, Hayes. I either freeze out here or I go knock on the front door. I'm going." He didn't wait for a response. He diverted all remaining auxiliary power to the thrusters and pushed the stray dog toward the equator of the colossal shape. As he got closer, the true scale of the structure became terrifyingly clear. The microscopic trench was a massive canyon, a sheer drop into blackness that could have swallowed a dozen dreadnoughts side by side. Gideon guided his small ship into the trench. The walls on either side were perfectly smooth, featureless expanses of black metal. He flew downward, the darkness swallowing him whole. He flipped on his external floodlights. The twin beams of white light cut through the void, illuminating the floor of the canyon. There, in the dead center of the trench floor, was a massive circular depression. A door. Gideon brought the stray dog down, hovering just above the surface. He checked his scanners. Nothing. No automated defense turrets. No energy fields. Just cold, dead metal. He engaged the magnetic landing gear. The ship touched down with a heavy, reverberating clank. The sound echoed through the canyon, carrying on some unseen atmospheric medium. "Command, I'm down!" Gideon breathed. "I'm on the door!" "Gideon, get back in your ship! That's an order!" Hayes yelled. "Ship's dead, sir. I'm going for a walk." Gideon locked his helmet into place, unsealed the airlock, and grabbed a heavy-duty plasma cutter and a handheld scanner. The inner door hissed open. He stepped out onto the surface of the alien world. Gravity. That was the first thing Gideon noticed. His magnetic boots didn't click against the surface. They weren't needed. The structure was generating its own gravity field, perfectly calibrated to roughly 1 Earth standard. He stood in the center of the massive circular door, shining his flashlight around. The beam was swallowed by the sheer scale of the canyon walls above him. He looked down at his scanner. It was dead. The magnetic interference here was absolute. He was relying purely on his eyes and his gut. He walked toward the center of the circular depression. The metal beneath his boots wasn't smooth like the walls. It was textured, covered in intricate microscopic grooves that almost looked like circuit pathways, though they were purely mechanical. At the exact center of the door was a raised dais, no taller than his knee. Atop it sat a dark, metallic pedestal with a single, hand-shaped indentation. "Well, that's incredibly cliché," Gideon muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin inside his helmet. He approached the pedestal. The indentation didn't look like an alien claw. It didn't have 6 fingers or tentacles. It looked distinctly, unsettlingly humanoid. 5 digits, a central palm, a proportional thumb. Gideon hesitated. He thought about the Kaelin and the Voth, with their elongated limbs and jointed mandibles. The counciled races didn't look like this. They didn't build like this. We didn't just survive the dark. We woke up what was sleeping there. Gideon placed his gloved hand over the indentation. It hovered an inch above the metal. He took a breath, the recycled air tasting stale in his mouth, and pressed his hand down. Nothing happened. He stood there for 10 seconds, feeling incredibly foolish. He pressed harder. Still nothing. "Right," he grunted, stepping back. Dead battery. He turned to head back to the freezing tomb of his ship. As he pivoted, the toe of his boot caught on the raised edge of the dais. He stumbled, throwing his hands out to catch his balance. His bare wrist, where the seal of his glove had worn thin from months of cheap repairs, slid hard against the sharp, unpolished edge of the pedestal. Fabric tore. Skin split. "Damn it!" Gideon hissed, recoiling. A thin line of crimson bloomed across his wrist. A single drop of blood welled up, fell, and hit the dark metal of the pedestal. The moment the blood touched the surface, the metal absorbed it, like water hitting dry earth. Gideon froze. A low, subsonic hum began to vibrate through the soles of his boots. It wasn't a mechanical grinding. It was a deep, resonant tone, like the striking of a massive tuning fork. The intricate grooves etched into the floor around him began to glow. First a dim, dying amber, then a surging, brilliant gold. The light raced outward from the pedestal, tracing a sprawling, geometric web across the entire surface of the circular door. "Cole!" Ilara's voice exploded in his earpiece, frantic and crackling. "Cole, what did you do? The entire structure is spiking in energy. Massive thermal blooms detected. I didn't do anything, I just bled on it," Gideon yelled back, backing away from the pedestal. The ground beneath him shifted. A massive tectonic groan echoed through the canyon. The circular door wasn't just a door. It was an iris. The heavy metal plates began to slide backward, spiraling outward with terrifying speed and total silence. There was no grinding of gears, no screeching of oxidized metal. The engineering was flawless, even after God knows how many millennia. Gideon scrambled backward, slipping on the smooth metal as the floor fell away in front of him. He managed to grab the landing strut of the stray dog, just as the edge of the iris passed beneath him. A rush of air blew up from the depths of the structure. It wasn't the stale, toxic atmosphere of a derelict ruin. It smelled of ozone, charged particles, and something sharp and clean. "Gideon, get out of there!" Hayes roared over the comms. "Energy levels are critical. It's going to blow." "It's not a bomb, Commander," Gideon said, pulling himself up, his eyes wide as he stared down into the abyss. "It's a door." The golden light from the floor pathways spilled down into the interior of the structure, illuminating a shaft that plunged miles deep. "I'm going in," Gideon said. Before Hayes could scream another order, Gideon detached his tether from the stray dog, checked his oxygen reserves, and stepped off the edge. He didn't fall. The localized gravity field caught him, lowering him down the massive shaft like an invisible elevator. He drifted downward, a lone speck of humanity descending into the throat of an ancient god. As he sank deeper, the golden lights flickered on in sequence, cascading down the walls of the shaft. He passed massive, dormant machines built into the walls, turbines the size of cities, conduits thick as rivers. This wasn't just a bunker. It was a forge. He touched down gently on a massive gantry overlooking a subterranean cavern so vast it had its own atmospheric haze. Gideon stood up, his flashlight beam entirely useless against the sheer volume of the space. Then the cavern lights came on. A blinding, crisp white light snapped into existence, illuminating the interior from thousands of recessed floodlights. Gideon threw his arm up, shielding his eyes from the sudden glare. When his vision cleared, he looked out over the railing of the gantry. His breath left him in a ragged gasp. "Command," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Are you getting this telemetry?" "We're getting it, Cole," Ilara said, her voice completely hollowed out by shock. Dear God, ranged out before him, perfectly aligned in hundreds of thousands of docking bays, was a fleet. They were dreadnoughts, sleek and brutal, built from the same dark, light-absorbing metal as the exterior. They were sharply angled, devoid of the Kalen's artistic curves or the Vorth's fragile rings. They were built for one thing: war. They were kilometers long, bristling with heavy kinetic macro cannons and energy lances that made the Council's most advanced weaponry look like children's toys. And there weren't just a few of them. The rows stretched on into the hazy distance, an armada large enough to conquer the Orion Spur 10 times over. Gideon walked slowly along the gantry, his mind struggling to process the scale. He approached the nearest dreadnought. Its boarding ramp was lowered, extending directly onto the walkway. Gideon stepped aboard. The interior was pristine. The air was breathable, rich and clean. He removed his helmet, dropping it onto the deck with a heavy thud. He walked into the bridge. It was cavernous, designed for a crew of hundreds. But the consoles... Gideon walked up to the command chair. He looked at the primary interface. There were no alien hieroglyphs, no bizarre, multi-limbed control yokes. There were keyboards, joysticks, pedals, screens formatted in distinct, logical arrays that mirrored early human spacecraft design. He looked down at the armrest of the command chair. There, etched into the dark metal, was a symbol. It was worn, faded by time, but unmistakable. A circle, enclosing a stylized, symmetrical pair of wings. An eagle. "Ilara," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He stared at the console, a slow, dangerous smile creeping across his scarred face. "They didn't cast us out into a graveyard." "What is it, Gideon?" Whose ships are those?" Gideon placed his bleeding hand onto the primary flight console. The bridge lit up instantly, power surging through the dreadnought as it recognized the iron, the DNA, the biological key of its creator. "They're ours," Gideon said. "They've always been ours." Commander Arthur Hayes was a man carved from weathered granite, a veteran of a dozen political skirmishes, and the brutal, grinding reality of the eviction. He had not smiled in 14 months. When he stepped off the shuttle onto the gantry of the subterranean shipyard, his jaw simply went slack. He walked past Gideon, ignoring him entirely, and moved toward the edge of the railing. Below him, the armada stretched into the artificial horizon. The dreadnoughts were a sea of matte black, silent and predatory. Ilara Jenkins followed closely behind Hayes, carrying a portable diagnostic suite. She stopped dead. The datapad slipped from her fingers, clattering against the metal grate. 300,000, Ilara whispered. Her voice shook, cracking under the weight of the number. The orbital probes are finally penetrating the lower decks. There are 300,000 of these ships, Commander. Cruisers, destroyers, carriers, all dormant. Not all of them, Gideon corrected. He leaned against the bulkhead of the nearest dreadnought, wrapping a makeshift bandage around his bleeding wrist. This one's awake. Hayes finally turned to look at Gideon. His eyes, usually hard and uncompromising, were wide with a frantic, desperate kind of hope. "You bled on a console, Cole. That's what you told me. You bled on a console, and a ghost fleet turned its lights on." "It's a biometric lock, sir," Gideon said, pushing himself off the wall. He led Hayes and Ilara up the boarding ramp and into the bridge of the awakened flagship. "It's looking for a specific genetic sequence, a specific iron-to-copper ratio in the blood. Human DNA. It's hardwired into the operating system." Hayes stepped onto the bridge. The air was warm, smelling faintly of ozone and something resembling pine. It was an intentional olfactory choice, an environmental setting designed to soothe biological crews. After over a year of breathing recycled carbon and the stench of unwashed bodies, the clean air hit Hayes like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, gripping the back of the nearest tactical station. Ilara rushed to the primary console. Her fingers flew over the keyboard. "The architecture—" She shook her head, tracing a line of physical toggle switches beneath a sleek, holographic display. "It's a bizarre mix of analog and hyper-advanced quantum processing. These physical switches are redundancies. In case of localized EMPs or digital warfare, you can fly this thing manually. The Council abandoned analog tech centuries ago." "Because the Council thinks they're invincible," Hayes muttered, running a calloused hand over the leather of the command chair. "Who builds a warship with analog redundancies?" "Someone who lost a war," Gideon said quietly. "Or someone who survived one." Hayes turned to the main viewport. The darkness of the cavern was held at bay by the ship's external floodlights. "Can we fly them? Can we actually get the civilian fleet inside?" "We don't need to transfer the civilians," Ilara said, pulling up a structural schematic on the main holo table. "Commander, look at the scale of these hangar bays. We don't have to move the people. We can just swallow our ships whole. The Daedalus, the transports, the frigates. We can land them inside the dreadnoughts. These things have internal atmospheric regulators that could sustain our entire population 10 times over." Hayes stared at the blue projection of the dreadnought. He was doing the math in his head. The fuel, the oxygen, the sheer, terrifying logistics of survival. For the first time in a year, the math was finally in their favor. "Do it," Hayes ordered, his voice dropping into a gravelly command tone. "Draft every able-bodied pilot. I want shuttles running back and forth to the surface. We bring our captains down here, we bleed them on the consoles, and we wake these leviathans up. Priority goes to the civilian transports. Get them inside the hangars. Plug their life support into the dreadnought's mainframes." "Yes, sir," Ilara said, already keying the comms. Hayes looked at Gideon. "You found this, Cole. You get the first chair. This ship is yours." Gideon looked at the command console, then out at the endless rows of sleeping giants. He thought about the Kaelan diplomats in their ivory towers, laughing as they signed the eviction mandate. He thought about the Vorth peacekeepers, welding humanity's weapons shut while children starved in the lower decks. "She needs a name, Commander," Gideon said, stepping up to the helm. Hayes looked around the bridge, his eyes settling on the faded eagle etched into the metal. "The Council threw us to the wolves, Cole. Let's show them what we found in the den. Call her Fenrir." The Exodus was a frantic, chaotic ballet of rusted metal and desperate people. For 3 days, the massive canyon on the surface of the black tetrahedron swallowed the remnants of human civilization. The UNS Daedalus, a ship that had once been the pride of the Earth Defense Fleet, looked like a child's broken toy as it drifted into the cavernous primary hangar of the Fenrir. Inside the dreadnoughts, the reality of their salvation began to set in. Gideon walked the lower decks of the Fenrir, watching the civilian refugees disembark from their cramped, freezing transports. They stepped onto the pristine metal floors of the ancient warship, with a hesitant, almost religious reverence. Children who had known nothing but the vibrating hum of failing scrubbers suddenly found themselves in wide, echoing corridors lit by warm, golden light. There was crying, a lot of it. But for the first time since the eviction, it wasn't from despair. Cole. Gideon turned. Chief Medical Officer Miller, a man who had looked grey and skeletal just a week ago, was jogging down the corridor. He was carrying a sealed metal container, and he had a manic, disbelieving grin plastered across his face. "Tell me we have food, Doc," Gideon said. "Better," Miller laughed, popping the seal on the container. He pulled out a dense, rectangular block wrapped in biodegradable film. "Hydroponics are dead, obviously. The seed banks are dust. But the ship's automated fabricators, they work. They break down base carbon, water, and ambient minerals, and they print this." Gideon took the block. It was heavy, the color of oatmeal. He peeled back the film and took a bite. It tasted like absolutely nothing. It was dense, dry, and entirely devoid of flavor. It was the best thing he had ever eaten. "Nutritionally complete," Miller said, his eyes bright. "Proteins, lipids, essential vitamins. The fabricators can produce 4 tons of it an hour." "We aren't going to starve, Gideon. Nobody's going to starve." Gideon swallowed hard, a sudden tightness gripping his throat. He clapped Miller on the shoulder. "Keep the fabricators running, Doc. Fill every stomach in the fleet." He left the medical officer and headed back to the bridge. The command deck was a hive of activity. Ilara had integrated the Daedalus's surviving mainframe into the Fenrir's systems. She was standing at the tactical holotable, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Hayes was beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. "Status, Jenkins?" Gideon asked, taking his place at the helm. "We have 200 dreadnoughts fully awakened," Ilara reported. "The entire civilian population is secure within the hangar bays. Life support is holding at a perfect 100%. Power cores are, well, they're terrifying. They draw ambient 0-point energy. They don't use fuel, Gideon. They literally just breathe the vacuum." "What about the navigation charts?" Hayes asked. Ilara tapped a sequence on the table. The hologram shifted, projecting a massive, 3-dimensional map of the Orion Spur. Gideon leaned in. The map was wrong. The stars were in the right places, but the planetary designations were entirely alien. The Kalan homeworld, a lush, temperate planet known as Ethel, was marked in harsh, jagged red coordinates. "I ran the ship's database through our translation matrix," Ilara explained, her voice dropping. "The language is a root derivative. It shares 90% of its syntax with Proto-Indo-European. It's us. It's undeniably us. But these dates? How old are these ships, Ilara?" Hayes demanded. "Based on stellar drift algorithms. 40,000 years." The bridge went silent. 40,000 years. Human recorded history was a fraction of that. "We didn't evolve on Earth," Gideon whispered, staring at the red marker over the Kalan homeworld. "We retreated there." "Look at the planetary tags," Ilara said, zooming in on the Kalan sector. "The translation doesn't list them as sovereign territories. It lists them as containment zones. The Voth sectors are listed as resource nodes." Hayes gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The implication was staggering. The galactic map wasn't a political boundary. It was a zoo. A zoo that humanity had built, managed, and eventually abandoned when they lost whatever cataclysmic war had forced them to retreat to a single, blue rock in the Sol system. The Council hadn't evicted humanity from their rightful place in the galaxy. The Council was just squatting in humanity's old house. "Commander," Gideon said, looking up from the map. His blood was singing, a hot, vicious rhythm thrumming in his ears. "The civilian fleet is secure. The ships are armed. We have full bellies and zero-point drives." Hayes looked out the viewport. The vast armada of black dreadnoughts sat waiting, a loaded gun pointed at the stars. "Spool up the drives, Cole," Hayes said softly. The cynical, beaten refugee was gone. In his place stood an admiral of the oldest fleet in the universe. "Let's go remind the council who owns the board." The edge of the Vale was heavily patrolled. The Kalan prelate, commanding a sleek, silver-hulled border cruiser named the Gilded Grace, sat back in his gel-contoured command chair. He despised this assignment. Patrolling the perimeter of the dead zones was a task meant for junior officers, not a decorated veteran of the High Council. "Any anomalous readings, sub-officer?" the prelate asked, sipping a cup of warmed nectar. "Nothing, Excellency," the sensor operator replied, his 4 elongated fingers dancing over the glass interface. "Only standard cosmic radiation and dust. The human refugees have been in the Vale for 14 months. Statistically, their life support failed 6 months ago. We are guarding a graveyard. The Council mandates certainty." The prelate droned, bored. The humans were a stubborn, parasitic species. Like pests, they have a habit of surviving where they should not. We remain until... The sensor operator's console emitted a sharp, high-pitched shriek. The glass interface flashed violent crimson. The Kalan crew flinched, their secondary eyelids snapping shut against the sudden glare. "Report!" the prelate snapped, sitting up and spilling his nectar. "Massive spatial distortion detected. Excellency, something is tearing a hole in the localized fabric of space. It is not a hyperlane breach. It is brute-forcing its way into real space. Defensive screens to maximum. Arm the plasma batteries." The stars outside the viewport twisted. Space did not warp or bend. It simply shattered. A rift of absolute blackness tore open in the vacuum, rimmed with violent, arcing purple lightning. From the tear, a ship emerged. The prelate stared. It was not a ship. It was a nightmare of geometry. It was a matte black wedge of pure violence, kilometer after kilometer of it, sliding out of the rift in total silence. It possessed no glowing engine nacelles, no elegant solar sails. It absorbed the light of the nearby stars, a moving void that cast a massive shadow over the Kalan cruiser. And it was not alone. Behind the flagship, space tore open again. And again. And again. 200 rifts. 200 monolithic, black dreadnoughts spilling out of the abyss, forming a flawless, impenetrable wall of armor that blocked out the sky. The Gilded Grace was a state-of-the-art Council warship. Next to the human vanguard, it looked like a rowboat facing down a tidal wave. "Targeting locks!" the prelate shouted, panic finally piercing his arrogant composure. "Acquire locks and fire a warning volley across their bow. Demand identification." The Kalan cruiser shuddered as its primary plasma batteries discharged. 2 massive bolts of superheated blue plasma streaked across the void, aimed precisely off the bow of the lead black dreadnought. The plasma bolts hit an invisible barrier 100 meters from the black hull. There was no explosion, no flare of dissipating energy. The shields didn't just block the plasma, they absorbed it. The blue light simply vanished, sucked into the ship's defensive grid like a drop of water into a desert. The Kalan bridge fell into dead, horrified silence. "Excellency," the comms officer whispered, his mandibles clicking in terror. "We are being hailed. Audio only. It is an unencrypted broadband frequency." The prelate swallowed hard. "Put it on." Static hissed through the pristine bridge of the Kalan cruiser, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a boot hitting a metal deck. Then a voice spoke. It was a human voice, speaking flawless Kalan, but laced with a rough, gravelly undertone that sent a shiver down the prelate's spine. "This is Commander Arthur Hayes of the Terran flagship Fenrir. 14 months ago, the High Council informed humanity that we were a destabilizing variable. You told us we did not fit into your equation." The lead dreadnought shifted slightly. Along its flanks, massive kinetic macro cannons the size of Kalan skyscrapers slowly tracked, locking directly onto the gilded grace. "You were right," Hayes's voice continued, chillingly calm. "We don't fit your equation, because we wrote the math." "Commander Hayes," the prelate stammered, frantically trying to regain his authority. "You are in violation of a High Council mandate. You are ordered to power down your vessels and submit to boarding, or you will be destroyed." A low, dark chuckle echoed over the comms. It wasn't Hayes. It was a younger, sharper voice. "You just shot us with plasma, prelate," Gideon Cole said. "Our shields catalogued it as a mild solar flare. You couldn't destroy us if we gave you the manuals to our ships." "What do you want?" the prelate demanded, his voice breaking. He looked at his sensor readouts. The human ships were emitting target lock telemetry so powerful it was physically heating the hull of his cruiser. "We want our house back," Hayes said. "You have exactly 1 hour to clear this sector. Retreat to your homeworld. Tell the High Council that the eviction is over. Tell them the architects have returned. And if we refuse to run?" The prelate tried to muster the pride of his species. "The Council has thousands of fleets. We will glass you." "Then we won't just evict you," Hayes replied, the comms channel crackling with the sheer power of the transmission. "We will overwrite you. Fenrir out." The channel snapped shut. The Kalan crew looked at their commander. For a moment, the prelate considered ordering a full broadside. He considered dying with honor for the High Council. But as he looked at the 200 leviathans blotting out the stars, the survival instinct of a prey animal took over. "Disengage," the prelate whispered. "Spin up the hyperdrives. Get us out of here." The gilded grace turned tail, its engines burning bright blue as it fled toward Council space. On the bridge of the Fenrir, Gideon watched the silver speck vanish into the hyperlane. He leaned back in the command chair, feeling the deep, resonant hum of the 40,000-year-old warship beneath him. Beside him, Hayes stared out at the open galaxy. They were no longer starving refugees. They were no longer victims of bureaucratic tyranny. They were the apex predators of the Orion Spur, and they had just been handed back their teeth. Gideon looked at the navigation map, at the sprawling territories claimed by the Council. "Set a course for the Kalan border, Elara," Gideon said, engaging the 0-point drive. "Let's go redecorate." The 0-point drives didn't tear a hole in reality. They didn't roar or spit irradiated exhaust. They simply folded space, grabbing the destination and pulling it toward the fleet like a tablecloth. 1 second, the 200 black dreadnoughts were sitting in the stagnant purple haze of the veil. The next, they were hovering in the high orbit of Ethel Prime. Ethel Prime was the crown jewel of the Kalan Empire. It was a world of shimmering, sapphire oceans and emerald continents, wrapped in a defensive grid that the High Council proudly called the Aegis Ring. A sprawling network of orbital fortresses, linked by golden hard-light shields and bristling with tens of thousands of plasma batteries. Stationed around the ring was the Council Home Fleet, 5,000 Kalan cruisers, Voth heavy destroyers, and sleek silver interceptors. It was an armada meant to project absolute, unquestionable authority across the Orion Spur. When the Fenrir and its vanguard dropped into real space, that authority evaporated. Gideon Cole sat in the command chair of the Fenrir, staring through the forward viewport. He was still wearing his grease-stained flight suit. His boots were scuffed. He smelled of sweat and old copper. but the ship beneath him hummed with the power of a dying sun, perfectly synchronized with his erratic, racing heartbeat. "Spatial anchors deployed," Ilara Jenkins reported from the tactical console. Her fingers moved over the analog switches with practiced ease. "We are holding stationary orbit, right above their capital." "Do they see us?" Commander Hayes asked, standing by the viewport with his hands clasped behind his back. "Sir, we are eclipsing their sun," Ilara said flatly. "They see us." The tactical holotable flared to life. 5,000 red icons swarmed like angry hornets, breaking formation and rushing toward the wall of black dreadnoughts. The local comms bands exploded in a chaotic symphony of Kalan panic and Voth military jargon. "They are locking targeting telemetry," Ilara said. "All 5,000 vessels. The orbital batteries on the Aegis ring are spooling up. Massive thermal spikes." Hayes didn't blink. "Let them." Gideon tightened his grip on the armrests. It was a massive gamble. The dreadnoughts were 40,000 years old. They had eaten Kalan plasma on the border, but this was the combined firepower of a galactic superpower. The space between the two fleets erupted. The Council didn't bother with a warning hail. They fired everything. Antimatter torpedoes streaked through the void, leaving jagged white contrails. Laser lances cut blinding blue lines across the darkness. Volley after volley of superheated plasma artillery slammed into the human vanguard. It was a storm of light and heat that would have vaporized the Daedalus in a microsecond. The payload struck the Fenrir. Gideon braced for the impact, his teeth clamped shut. The dreadnought shuddered. It was a slight, rhythmic vibration, like a heavy truck rolling over a pothole. That was it. Outside the viewport, the void was a boiling cauldron of detonating ordnance. But 100 meters from the hull of the black ships, the explosions simply died. The zero-point shields didn't deflect the energy. They consumed it. The harder the Council fleet fired, the brighter the ambient lighting on the Fenrir's bridge became. The ancient warships were feeding on the assault. "Shield capacity is at 100%, Ilara announced, a slow, disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. "They're actually charging our auxiliary batteries, Gideon. They're giving us free power." The bombardment lasted for 3 agonizing, blinding minutes. When the Council fleet finally ceased fire, their weapon banks overheated and their torpedo tubes empty, the smoke and ionized gas cleared. The 200 dreadnoughts sat exactly where they had been, unscathed, unmoved, a monolith of dark, quiet violence. The comms channels went dead silent. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, suffocating terror. The Kalan had thrown their best punch, and humanity hadn't even flinched. "Our turn," Gideon muttered, his hand hovering over the primary fire control. "Disarm them, Cole," Hayes ordered, his voice echoing in the cavernous bridge. "Show them the difference between an eviction and an execution." Gideon tapped the analog targeting matrix. He bypassed the heavy kinetic macro cannons. He didn't want to crack the planet in half. He selected the energy lances. "Targeting the Aegis ring," Gideon said, focusing on the primary weapon pylons. Firing. He depressed the heavy brass firing stud. There was no sound. There was no recoil. A single, pencil-thin beam of pure, incandescent white light shot from the bow of the Fenrir. It crossed the orbital gap in a fraction of a second. It struck the golden hard light shield of the Aegis ring. The Council shield shattered like cheap glass, dispersing into a harmless rain of golden sparks. The white beam sliced cleanly through the massive titanium alloy housing of the ring's primary plasma battery. It didn't detonate the reactor. It just cut the weapon completely off its mount. The massive gun drifted away into space, a clean, cauterized hole left in its wake. Gideon adjusted the targeting yoke. The Fenrir traced a line of white light across the orbital ring. Down the line, the other 199 dreadnoughts joined in. It was a surgical amputation on a macroscopic scale. In less than 40 seconds, the human fleet systematically neutered the Aegis ring. Thousands of weapons drifted harmlessly into the void. The defensive platforms were intact. The crews were alive, but they were entirely, humiliatingly disarmed. The Black Fleet powered down their lances. The quiet returned. On the tactical board, the 5,000 council ships were completely motionless. They were floating in the debris of their own shattered defenses, realizing exactly how outmatched they were. "Incoming transmission," Ilara said softly. "It's the High Council. Wide-band video." "Put them on the main viewer," Hayes commanded. The viewport shifted, projecting a massive holographic image of the council chamber. At the center stood the Kalen High Minister, his silver robes looking suddenly drab and foolish. He was surrounded by terrified delegates from a dozen species. "Terran fleet," the High Minister said. His voice trembled, the artificial translator struggling to smooth out his frantic tone. "You have breached sovereign space. You have fired upon the capital." "Cut the bureaucratic nonsense, Minister," Hayes interrupted, stepping into the field of view. He didn't look like a diplomat. He looked like a tired, angry man who had finally found a very big stick. 14 months ago, you threw my people into the Veil to die. You thought you were clearing the board. You just woke up the players." The High Minister swallowed heavily, his mandibles twitching. "What is the nature of your demand, Commander?" "You don't get to ask questions," Hayes said flatly. "Look at the ships orbiting your world. Scan the metals. Scan the energy signatures. They predate your civilization by 40,000 years. This galaxy was ours before you even learned how to harness fire. We left it to you, and you ruined it." Gideon watched the faces of the alien delegates. The realization was washing over them, a slow, horrifying dawn. The humans weren't pests. They were the architects. They were the precursor race the Council had spent centuries digging up in the dirt. "We want the eviction mandate revoked immediately," Hayes continued. "We are reclaiming the central sectors. You will dismantle your blockades around our original colonies, and you will never, ever dictate the terms of our survival again. Do you understand?" "If we refuse," a Voth general barked from the back of the chamber. Gideon leaned forward in the command chair. He didn't shout, he just let the quiet menace carry over the comms. "Then we don't use the scalpels next time. We use the hammers." The High Minister looked at the Voth general, then back to the imposing figure of Hayes. The Kalen's shoulders slumped, the pride of an empire broken in less than 5 minutes. "We agree to your terms," the minister whispered. "The mandate is rescinded. Welcome back to the galactic stage, humanity." Hayes didn't smile. "We never left." He signaled Ilara, and the transmission cut out. The bridge of the Fenrir was silent for a long moment. Then, from the lower decks, a sound began to echo up through the ship's ventilation shafts. It started as a low murmur, then swelled into a roar. The civilian refugees, watching the feed from the hangar bays, were cheering. It was a raw, deafening sound of pure salvation. Gideon slumped back in the leather chair. He looked down at his wrist. The cut from the pedestal had already scabbed over, a thin red line binding him to the ancient metal of the ship. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "Set a course for Earth, Ilara," Gideon said, a genuine smile finally cracking his scarred face. "Let's go home. The universe has a funny way of balancing the scales. The Council tried to bury humanity in the dark, but they didn't realize we were the seeds of an empire that had already conquered the stars. If you loved this epic tale of survival, vengeance, and ancient cosmic secrets. Smash that like button and share it with your friends. What did you think of the Fenrir and the Sleeping Fleet? Sound off in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more incredible HFY sci-fi stories every week. Stay stellar and see you next time.